Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here with Julian Kölbel, Assistant Professor of Sustainable Finance at the University of St Gallen, to discuss a series Harald Walkate and I wrote for ECGI titled Does Sustainable Investing Work? And I should say that Julian is an author of one of the academic review papers that Harald and I drew on heavily in producing this series, and he's also published extensively in top finance journals on sustainable finance. And so, Julian, I'm delighted that you have agreed to have this conversation today, and you're very welcome.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
So I'd like to start with your reactions to the series of articles we put together, and we'll put a link to those articles in the show notes. But in brief, we hypothesized that in order to have impact on real world outcomes, then sustainable investing strategies need to successfully achieve three stages. And we use the analogy of the three phases of a rocket required to get a satellite successfully into orbit. So in the first stage, the investors' actions must actually have some effect on the companies in which they invest. So for example, divesting from a high polluting company might increase their cost of capital. But then in the second stage, managers at the company need to respond to that effect. They need to notice it, and they need to change their actions at the company so that there is an effect in the real economy. So, for example, if the cost of capital has gone up, they may invest less in dirty activities. But then in the third stage, the impact must persist and not be offset by actions of competitors, for example, who might step in to produce the dirty goods that the first company reduces. And when we reviewed the academic evidence on sustainable investing, this suggested to us that conventional sustainable investing techniques struggle to make it through all three phases. And this led us to conclude that sustainable investors wanting to have impact perhaps need to have more modest goals, or perhaps focus on less achieving outcomes directly and more on influencing the circumstances in which good outcomes can occur. And this could include realistic engagement objectives or policy influence. But let's start with your reactions to our work and being positive. What did we get right in your view?
Well, I think first I'd like to congratulate you on this analogy. I mean, who doesn't love a rocket? And I think you've found a great way of expressing this perhaps more academic thought that this is a long causal chain that you sort of have to carefully think through. And having a rocket that first launches, then takes off, the second stage and launches into orbit is a great way of framing it. I really like it, and I find it very helpful. I think it's also great because you've noticed that, and we know that too from writing a review paper. It is actually difficult to piece together all these academic papers that tend to answer very specific questions into a coherent answer to a big question, which does sustainable investing work, is a big question. It's an important question. So I think you're absolutely on the right track of attempting that answer. It's ambitious, and it's great that you did it. And I think even more people should really struggle with that. And I think you've come up with a very good answer. And then I also agree on the takeaway that the real impacts of sustainable investing are limited, for sure. And if you really want to have them, you need to think carefully and perhaps get a little more creative than what's sort of commonly on the menu.
And so what do you think we either got wrong or perhaps didn't emphasize enough?
Yes, I think I'd like to make two remarks. I think the first is that as great as the analogy is, it also it puts a pretty high bar. Especially if you sort of compare it to what else we might do about climate change, right? So if we think back the sort of the 50 years that societies have been debating the issue of climate change and what to do about it, we really haven't come up with many rockets to shoot out that we can really say, oh, they've made it into orbit. And it has to do with a similar problem that sort of this larger question is difficult to answer. But for example, there is a review paper on the European emission trading system, which is one of the big policy measures that, based from theory, we would say, well, if you create a market, it's mandatory by the government and it includes the whole economy.
Mm.
And apparently, the evidence for its impact, both on emissions and primarily on innovations that would enable the economy as a whole to become more efficient, is limited. You see,
Right.
so I think it would, struggle at stage 1 or 2 already. So in that sense, so I think the rocket analogy is still the right thing. But then to say, well, sort of that shows us sustainable investing doesn't really work. I think if we apply that analogy further, I think we realize our entire toolkit is actually pretty limited. So this sort of humility about what works is probably, a good thing to have across the board. And that's just, that's something to broaden perhaps the horizon of the review. And the second thing I wanted to add is one of the takeaways is that voluntary action sort of doesn't get us there. And I see why you say that. And I think you mean especially voluntary action by financial institutions or corporations. But I would be careful here because at the end of the day, I think voluntary action is really all we got in its different forms, right? So I think no one has an incentive to take care of the climate. It is, the perfect tragedy of the commons. Even, individuals themselves, they don't gain as much from saving the climate as they expend on doing so. Right? If you limit your own consumption, right? It's really, you do that, voluntarily. There's no economic reason to do it. And then also nation states, there's always the other countries, right? That could make up for your beautiful policies that you enact nationally. So there again, and you need a majority of voters who, out of their own volition, vote for a program that really changes the economy. So I'm not, I agree that voluntary action often fails or doesn't get as far as we would like it to do. But I think I view voluntary action as a precious resource that we ought to nurture, develop, and channel it to the right means. That for sure. But sort of, I'd rather not become that a kind of blanket notion that voluntary action isn't the thing that gets us there. It will eventually be the thing that gets us there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, and just reflecting on how we thought about that in our work. I guess that plays into a little bit about corporations thinking and investors thinking about where they direct their voluntary actions. And perhaps, it's tough for investors to, seek to actually, deliver the outcome, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be seeking to contribute to an environment and a set of circumstances where, we collectively become able to act.
Yes. I agree. And the best thing of course, is to take your ambition to do something about the climate or whatever other, social good it may be, and think very carefully, what is the best thing that you at this moment, as this institution or this person can do. But then, of course, as your review shows, it's actually not so easy to figure out what is the best thing. And then sometimes in telling other people, oh, what you're doing is actually wrong, you might end up just eroding their ambition rather than redirecting them. So I think that's very important to me.
And so I mean, you studied this whole question of sustainable investing a lot from a number of different perspectives. So how would you describe your own view now about what the most effective areas of action are, what does work in sustainable investing and what doesn't?
Yeah, I agree with you that engagement is is a pretty reasonable thing to do for investors. There is substantial evidence that it works to some extent. although it usually works in terms of, baby steps to little steps. So this is not kind of a transformative force.
Mm.
I think you call it limitations aware
Mm.
engagement. So we've discussed it before, right? You called it the zone of discretion. So there's a number of things that any company could do that sort of lie within managerial discretion. They are at least not obviously net negative, right?
Mm.
They might not be at the very top of the list of the
Mm.
best investment opportunities, but they seem reasonable to do, maybe in the longer term. So I think all of these things are fair game for shareholder engagement. So I think here the power lies not in achieving breakthrough change, but the
Mm.
power lies in its breadth. Right. If a large investor engages with large corporations, that can have global effects,
Mm.
which are often out of the reach of national policymakers, of
Mm.
course, right?
Yeah.
And so I think also that international dimension is something very interesting where investors have an advantage.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so then the capital allocation, sort of the effect of tilting your investment portfolio to certain companies and
Mm.
on the cost of capital. That is, I think, in principle, is a very powerful mechanism because if the cost of capital changes, that of course changes the whole
Mm.
calculus of
Mm.
the corporate managers. And there, I'm on the fence. So the
Mm.
empirical evidence is just so some people say, this has, absolutely no
Mm.
effect or is too
Mm.
small to be relevant.
Mm.
Some papers suggest that it might be not so small, something in the range of 0.5%.
Mm.
So a recent paper called "In Search of the True
Yeah.
Greenium" sort of comes out at that number.
Yeah.
So 0.5% is not the world, but it's also certainly more than nothing. So here
Mm.
I don't know.
Mm.
We'll have to see. I'll sort of
Mm.
hedge my bets there, and then I think one of the major levers is um, fostering innovation. I think especially for the climate problem, it seems obvious to me that as soon as there is superior technology in an area, for example, power production,
Mm.
superior in the sense of being cheaper, more reliable, whatnot,
Mm.
then things sort of happen on their own. And but sort of somebody has to bring that technology into the world. And of course, you need inventors and entrepreneurs, but you also need financing for that.
Mm.
And I think that's a really important role that investors, where they can bring something to the table that
Mm.
that is actually additional in that sense, is sort
Mm.
of funding the marginal innovation that
Mm.
seems just a tad too risky at the moment.
Mm.
I think that's a really important area to play in.
And do you see that as being focused in sort of venture capital, or do you see a role for investors engaging with larger corporates to encourage them to have a different risk profile about their investments? Is it one or the other or both? How do you see it?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely both, right?
Mm.
So that's also a good outcome if a promising startup is then acquired by a large
Mm.
corporate that
Mm.
scales the technology. That's fine too. But I think if you think of the way the investment industry structures its product, yes, I'm thinking of risk capital.
Mhm.
And I think especially Europe has here an interesting challenge before it, because I think it's actually a more general problem than just the climate. So sort of
Mm.
this
Mm.
venture capital is an issue in Europe.
Mm.
There's you see some migration of companies to
Mhm.
the US simply for funding conditions. So I think doing something about that is a very interesting policy perspective for Europe that,
Mm.
also is a bit broader than just doing something about the climate. So I
Mm.
think there's promise there. Yes.
Mm. Mm. I mean, in the work that we did, we very much focused on the impact dimension of
Mhm.
sustainable investing, i.e., having an impact on real world sustainability outcomes. But one of the questions I'm always really interested in is what is actually going on in the heads of end investors when they select sustainable investments. I mean, is impact what they think they're getting, or do they think they're going to get better returns, or is it just in about investing in line with their values, or even just making themselves feel better about themselves. And you've done some really interesting experimental and survey studies in this area. And what are you concluding from the research that you've done so far?
Yes, that's a question I'm also really interested in. And it is interesting because from the action, so investor buys a green investment fund, for example,
Mm,
you of course you can't conclude what is going on is in this person's head. Why did they buy it? It looks
mm,
the same if they bought it based on the expectation that this will be perform extremely well,
mm,
or if they bought this, knowing full well that this will perform poorly, but at least, they're having an impact, or maybe they just do it to feel better about it.
mm, mm,
Exactly. So,
mm,
so I think so. We had one study where we try to measure people's willingness to pay for two investment
mhm,
products.
mhm,
And one of them was giving them an impact in terms of CO2 reductions.
mm,
So that was very explicit, 500 kilograms of CO2 reductions per year. And then, what are you going to pay for that? And we found a substantial willingness to pay.
mhm,
So the first we concluded, well, okay, people really value that sort of aspect of the investment, keeping return and risk and
mhm,
everything the
mhm,
same. But then another group, we offered the same deal basically, but 10 times greater impact
mhm,
for the green product.
mm.
They also had a willingness to pay for that product, but it was the same as
Yeah.
the prior one. So uh, then people sort of value this, but they don't know how to value this.
Mm,
This is
mm,
how I would sort of
mm,
phrase it.
mm,
And now then some frame this as people could either be consequentialists, as in
mm,
people that, care about what are the consequences of
mm,
my actions, or they could be motivated by warm glow.
mm,
That is, I actually don't care about the consequences. I
mm,
feel about how I myself feel
mm,
when I make this purchase.
mm,
But what and what we find is kind of looks like warm glow, right? Sort of
mm,
people kind of
mm.
want the green thing, but they don't care how green it is. But
Yeah.
what I think is really going on, and I think this ties to your review, is that people in principle want to do the right. Surprisingly, many people sort of
Mm,
say, okay, faced with an investment decision,
mm,
okay, yeah, I want to do the right thing.
mm,
They're willing to sacrifice a little bit for that. But in our case, that was in terms of fees.
mm,
Um, but they just don't quite know how to think about these
mm,
impacts. And I
mm.
understand that. That's
Yeah.
that's complicated. So I think people are consequentialists sort of at the bottom of their heart, but they're just sort of, incapable of really calculating the consequences of their action. And they're
Mm,
also maybe slightly lazy, you could say,
mhm.
or simply out of their depth in thinking about this.
Yeah.
So they respond to simple signals.
Mm, mm,
This is what we find. So I think what that
mm,
means for a
mm,
policymaker who wants to make sustainable investing impactful
mm,
is that you'd want to think about a labeling regime that offers a very clear signal to the investor.
mm,
But on the other side of the label, on the supplier side,
mm,
sets incentives where you are, pretty certain that these are incentives that will lead to investments in actually sustainable infrastructure, or sort of, set the right incentives on the firm side.
mm.
I think that's the challenge here.
It's very interesting. I mean, I have to say I have a lot of sympathy with consumers, having spent a year of my life trying to figure this stuff out, and it's very difficult and complicated, and it is very difficult to put precise kind of numbers and impacts on these things, isn't it? A lot of your recent research has worked with these sort of approaches of experimental settings, either with individuals or institutions, as opposed to sort of classical archival analysis. What is it that draws you to those research methods, and why do you think they're important in addressing the important questions in sustainable investing?
Yeah, I like experiments mainly, I think, for their elegance. Once the results are in, so I think
Mm,
it's really it's a bit about the style of working. In an experiment, it's more like the show business, let's say. You prepare for a long time. You think carefully, how are we going to set this up?
Mm.
And then at some point you say, okay, let's run it. And and then the results just come in, and then you report them.
Mm.
There is no, oh, let's add on another data set. Let's extend it for another 10 years. Let's, so that that's something I personally like about experiments. But there are also, there's sort of scientific reasons to use them. And that is that they can be very powerful in isolating cause and effect. So for example, at the individual level, we were interested whether individuals kind of make a trade-off between investing sustainably and voting for climate policies. So there's a concern that perhaps people, by making a sustainable investment, sort of have exhausted their ambition to do something about the climate, and then they're not politically engaged anymore. And if we believe that political engagement is actually more impactful, that would be sort of bad for the overall climate change outcome. And this is very difficult to figure out from archival data. We know that in the US, states that vote more democratic, they invest more sustainably, so that's kind of well known. But that doesn't necessarily say that one causes the others, right? It's just the kind of people that live there potentially. So in an experiment, we were able to sort of allow one group to take the sustainable investment and then look into their donation and the willingness to donate to a climate policy process here in Switzerland. And we sort of could isolate really what is the effect of the opportunity to invest green on your willingness to contribute politically. And we found a null result. So we find that people don't dial down their willingness to donate in this experiment, which I wasn't sure we were going to find this, but knowing this now, I'm relieved. I think that takes a bit of the burden from sustainable investing, that at least it is probably not counterproductive in this other arena. Which I think is important, because if it were, the bar for the evidence of sustainable investing having a positive impact would be higher, actually.
Right. Yeah. It's like if we had like a fixed budget of attention or something, we'd have to be very careful how we spent it, wouldn't we?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think, trying to really be very specific about cause and effect is one important reason to set up experiments for me.
Yeah. And I mean, just looking more broadly, given that you have done a very extensive review paper in this whole area, and you've worked extensively yourself personally in this area, what do you think the priority areas for further academic research are? What should our colleagues really be looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would like to see more review papers, actually. I think that's a really important area, and other disciplines have established traditions of review papers. If you look at sort of healthcare economics, right, that they really carefully think about different insurance models and what leads to the best aggregate outcome. In the natural sciences, there are tons of large review papers. In finance and economics, it's less of a thing. I think that's a bit of a gap we should close. You've started. So I hope you'll continue. Other areas that I see as promising are, so a lot of the research is in the US public equity market, simply because that's the largest market, but it's also the most convenient to research. So I think we have to branch out into asset classes and mechanisms that are perhaps not so easy to research. And I think one very important aspect is real estate. So if you think at the individual level, my hunch is that the most sensible, impactful personal investment that you can make if you already own a house, is to invest in the energy efficiency of that house. It is no doubt additional, and no one else will come and replace your heating system.
Yeah.
No worries about that.
Yeah. No
I
one will
think
reverse their heating system because you put yours in.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that channel is also kind of cut. So you're in control. You're not a
Yeah.
minority owner. It's your house, right? And the savings can be significant. So housing contributes, I think something 20 to
Yeah.
30% to most
Yeah.
economies' emissions. So there's a lot to gain.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think that has been properly sort of researched and documented. And I think, that's part of the reason why that perhaps if people think about, oh, how should I, invest my retirement savings sustainably, that flies under the radar, even though it should perhaps be the first thing people think about.
It's very interesting, that, isn't it? And I mean, and that does translate to the institutional sphere as well, because, I mean, building decisions that are made about building upgrades, they happen periodically and then they don't happen for another 1 or 2 decades. They have very long lasting effects. And, and actually are much less reversible than some corporate commitments that we've seen. And so I think it is an interesting hypothesis, actually, that real estate investment could be an area where actually you can have quite a lot of impact through some of the sustainable investment techniques like engagement that we know do have some purchase.
Yes, so exactly it extends to real estate investment trusts, of course, and I mean, the whole mortgage business is huge, of course, and banks, that might be a channel where banks, they have a point of contact with homeowners, and then they may come in at the right moment with an energy audit. And I think often it's about, I think there may be a lot of informational frictions as well, again, that some home improvements may actually, be investments in the sense that they, that pay off over time. If you do it right with the tax bids you can get, I think but those investments are of course much harder to find than if I just go online and invest into the next best fund. So I think there's a real role for banks perhaps to inform clients about these kinds of things. Yeah, there's an interesting paper by colleagues at MIT, Bram Vandercroft. They've shown that if you time your engagement efforts with these refurbishment cycles, that you kind of know where they are when they come, then you can be much more impactful, because that's kind of the time when they need money anyways, and sort of it's. So that's an interesting paper. It's a working paper that goes in that direction.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, Julian, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a really enlightening and quite different conversation, actually, in this series. So thanks very much for that. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm a big fan of the series. I'm happy to contribute, and I'm looking forward to more. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.